I saw RFK Jr.'s post recently. He was talking about banks unbanking people, meaning that you have a bank account and the bank rings you up and tells you that they're no longer able to offer you services for something you said on a different platform. And his opinion was that banks should not be able to do this as they're basically a utility. I thought about this for a little while and I have a slightly different opinion on that matter. And it depends specifically on what bank, on what stage the unbanking is taking place. Let me go into it a bit more. Now, the straightforward argument for not allowing banks to do this is simple. Payments have become an integral part of who we are and the things that we need to get done every day. You need to be able to pay for food. You need to be able to pay for transportation. You need to be able to pay for a large range of things. And now that a lot of these things happen digitally, banking has become even more important. Basically, if you don't have a bank, it's very difficult for you to survive. Hence the utility comparison that RFK Jr. made. Having said that, the counter argument would be freedom of association. So the argument is that a person or an entity even should be able to deny services to someone for, some will say for any reason, but for the purpose of this video, I'll say for conscience reasons, meaning that for many cases where banks are unbanking people, or where PayPal, for instance, or eBay or other entities are removing people, it's because they disagree with things that they say or they believe in. Some people have the idea that entities should not have any thoughts or any moral preferences. They should offer services to whoever comes to get their service. That's not how humanity works. As an entrepreneur or anybody that builds a business would know, when you build your business is not divorced from you. Your business is part of you. You pour your heart, sweat, tears into it. Who you are goes into the business as well. It's impossible for anybody who really cares about a business to run the business without putting themselves into it. This means that you'll make judgment calls based on values that you have. And some of those values will be moral values. For instance, I wouldn't want to run a business, and many people wouldn't want to run a business where they had to offer services to Nazis. You wouldn't want to create a Nazi flag. You wouldn't want to print it out a Nazi flag. You wouldn't want to, or let's say the masterpiece cake shop guy who wouldn't want to, for religious reasons, bake a cake that celebrates a gay marriage. His heart is in the business. Now, the Supreme Court makes a differentiation when it comes to offering the service because of his artistic tendencies, right? He's putting some part of himself, again, his imagination into the cake making, and it violates his conscience. I won't talk about that in this video. That's something I'll think a lot more about later. But generally, people put their hearts and minds into what they do. So a payment service or a payment service or a bank would not want to facilitate someone or enable someone who's using their services to, let's say, raise funds for a Nazi march. They may not want to do that. And for that reason, freedom of conscience reasons, that's fair. The question, however, becomes two things. One, where is the line drawn? Where is the compromise? And two, reliance. If I allow someone to start using my services and then later on discover what they're doing, should I be able to just cut them off at that point? Or do I now, because I allowed them to start in the beginning, owe them a period of time to adjust, right? In law, they call that reliance, detrimental reliance. You've allowed someone to rely on you to their detriment. They could have sought other services, but they sought yours. You now have the right to reject those services from them. And my answer is no, you don't, at least not immediately. But let's get a little more nuanced. So in the case of banks, there are many banks. There's Bank of America, there's JP Morgan. If you're international, there's likely many banks that you have access to where you are, meaning you can take your money out of one bank and put it into another bank. In cases where you have options, and this applies to the Masterpiece Cake Shop case as well, where a person has options, they can go to the individual or the singular entity does not owe them continuous service. And again, this depends on specific instances. But in general, if you can go from one bank to another, one bank rejects your service, then the bank should be able to reject your service for conscience reasons. But if the bank has already made you rely on them, meaning you came, you opened a bank account, whether or not they knew who you were when you opened it is a different question. But they've now allowed you to start using. The longer you've been using their services, the more of a reliance you've built on them, the more they owe you continuous service, at least for a while. So they could give you notice within 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. We will shut down your account because we have discovered these activities that we do not think are proper and we don't want to be involved in it. I may not approve specifically of their thoughts. Like a lot of this is happening to conservatives. I may not approve of that, but the bank should be able to do it. Now, so that's the bank now. Now, what we've seen increasingly happening though is that other services behind them, Visa and MasterCard, are also doing the same. Visa is putting pressure on certain entities to unbank certain people. And that's where I'd say it shouldn't happen. Here's the reason why. The more of a monopoly you have, the more you shouldn't have the choice to remove people. Let me be more specific. The more of a monopoly you have in services that are important and existential to the individual, the less options you have to remove people from that service. So banks, they're a dime a dozen, they're everywhere. There are financial services you can use. But Visa and MasterCard are not the same. They're two entities in the whole world that have the most control over the world's financial services. So those services should not, by their own thoughts, be able to remove anyone from their service. Why? Because you can't just move to somebody else. So how about their freedom of conscience? Well, when you are that large, when you're that big, and you control so much, and nobody has an option to go elsewhere, then you are trading some part of your freedom of conscience to service certain people. And again, it depends on the service. Now, on a principled level, should this be? The answer is no. On a principled level, even if you have Visa and MasterCard, you should still be able to refuse someone if the principle is going to apply. The reason why we make the exception in this case is rather for practical reasons, meaning that for practical reasons. And that's why I said if it's existential, meaning if a person gets taken off Visa and MasterCard, they'll basically not be able to do anything, including practically buy food, right? Because you need to store your money in a bank. The banks use Visa and MasterCard for you to be able to withdraw food from the ATM machine. So you will not have access to be able to do that in the increasingly digitized world where your access to cash is limited. So getting cash in of itself in a convenient manner, or even in a practical manner in many Western nations, would be basically impossible. It will almost be impossible for you to work without using or do anything without using Visa or MasterCard anywhere in the world. And for that reason, Visa and MasterCard should not have the choice to basically sentence people to death. That's why I said when you become that large for something that is existential, then you no longer have the choice to remove anybody else, because the option from that, the repercussions of you doing that is basically a gross change in quality of life or even death. The person just won't be able to buy food anywhere else. They have to basically go open a farm someplace else, and that's not acceptable. So at that level, and that's basically why utilities don't have the choice to do this as well, because utilities have basically the same service to an extent. Like a power company that takes away power from someone basically makes their life almost unlivable. The phone company, it's slightly different, but it's basically the same thing. I think landlines used to be like that, but for mobile companies, you can switch to AT&T or switch to T-Mobile. It's less, but that's a thought for another day. But for payments, yes, at that level, Master and Visa card, when you basically control the world movement of money, you shouldn't have the option to remove anybody's service. Now, what if we come to a smaller town, right, where there's basically one motel or one hostel, and they decide they're not going to accommodate somebody because of their political beliefs, or in some cases because of their race, like it used to happen? What do we do in those instances? this is a lot more tricky. Number one, now personally, if I'm running such a country or such a town, I'll outlaw stuff like that. The reason is when you get to a local level, you are at the local level, it becomes less a question of freedoms and becomes a lot more a question of fulfillment. And a local community tries to create an environment where they'll find the most fulfillment. Some people say man's search is for happiness, pursuit of happiness, but it's really pursuit of fulfillment. That's why someone who pursues pleasure in order to be happy ends up unhappy, because that freedom to do whatever you want is what we think we want. But in reality, it's not. What we want is fulfillment. And fulfillment, ironically, comes from sometimes stopping or limiting your own pleasure. Sacrificing pleasure for something that is greater than yourself gives you higher purpose, higher meaning, higher fulfillment than just happiness would. But that again is a video for another day. But so on a local level, then the question is, the people at the local level have to decide, do they want to, is this the kind of environment they want to keep, where someone can refuse service to someone based on their race, not based on merit, not based on character, just based on their race for prejudicial reasons. And that's the choice that the people will have to make. So on a local level, I'd outlaw that. In general, should a town be able to do that? Now, if you are a person who, if again, now you have an accommodation, you're the only one in town, this person is traveling. If they're not staying in your place, they may have to stay outside, maybe in the cold. Now, for that one, there's a balance here. The balance here would be, because again, shelter is something that's very important to survival. I'd say you shouldn't be able to refuse someone shelter for non-meritorious reasons. You shouldn't be able to refuse someone accommodation for reasons without merit. But again, that depends on how much of a monopoly you are. So the more of a monopoly you are in control, the less choice you should have. Now, what if generally in a whole town, everybody decides that they're not going to do it? Then, again, if I'm leading that town, my answer would be, you stop it. Everyone should be able to accommodate everyone. And I think at the local level, authorities should be able to do that. There are certain freedoms that should be able to be limited at the local level, again, for reasons of fulfillment and principle. That's why, for instance, that's something for another day. But then, in general, should they? They should be. An entity should be able to refuse service to anybody for freedom of association's sake. Now, this will not be what many people want to hear, and that's why it's up to you to build the society you want. The Civil Rights Act was a good act because it as much as the Constitution allows, it limited certain freedoms. But do the freedoms exist? Meaning, in of itself, do the freedoms exist? The freedoms are not used in the way I want them to be used, but the freedoms exist. Yes, the freedom of association exists. You, as a person and as a business, can associate with whoever you want and not associate with whoever you want. But again, the movement to change that on a level, a local level, such that you do not allow that in your own country or in your own locality, depending again on the issue at hand, then I think that was sound for them to change it. But it's a restriction on a freedom that people actually have. It's just that people are allowed, or a community is allowed to restrict such freedoms when it's about a collective culture, a collective definition of who we are as a people. They should be allowed to change that. So that's my take on this. Feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. I'll consider whatever comments you have, and if it requires a follow-up video, I'll make one. Thank you guys for watching. See you in the next one.